Yo guys, what is up? Max for Diablo 4 video, and today we're going over what I believe to be the best sorcerer build. Now, this sorcerer build cleared a Nightmare 100 dungeon at only level 90. It is doing 40 million damage to single targets with group explosions. We're getting 50 million procs. It is just absolutely crazy, and I didn't know that sorcerer could do this because obviously I thought sorcerer was pretty weak with all of the nerfs. However, this build is using some really cool synergies with some of the new hearts that I want to break it down for you guys today. Now, this build is courtesy of my friend A. Chevy. You can find a link down to his channel below. I have reached out to a few close friends who I know are really great at making builds, and we're collaborating together to kind of bring you guys more builds to the channel because I've been covering Diablo for over a month now, and I've only brought druid and barb builds to the channel. So I'm going to be bringing some more builds courtesy of some of my friends to the channel for you guys, and we're still going to have the written guides and everything broken down. But I needed to share this build with you guys because doing a Nightmare 100 dungeon at only level 90 blows my mind, and so we're going to be breaking down everything you guys need to know. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Let's get right into it. So we're going to start with an overview of the build, and then we'll get into the gear specifics, the skill tree, the enchantment slots, Paragon Board, everything you need to know. So to start us off, this is an Ice Shards build. Ice Shards is one of Sorcerer's, if not Sorcerer's, best core abilities, and this build has been tailor-made to use the Barber Heart to the best of our ability. The Barber Heart is probably the best SORC tool that we have right now. This SORCs got nerfed. They lost their damage, they lost cooldowns, they lost survivability, but they are actually one of the best classes with the Barber Heart. Now, the reason for that is the SORC gets to use the best version of the Barber Heart. So the Barber Heart reads critical strikes and all subsequent damage within a range of 2 to 4 seconds, is absorbed by your target, then the absorbed damage erupts onto surrounding enemies. Stored damage is increased by 12x per second. Now, I used on my druid build a version of this, and I intended to use a version of this where the duration was less than 3 seconds. The reason for that is because on every character except for like SORC and Necro, you get a free exploit glyph, and the exploit glyph is going to give you free vulnerable procs on enemies. It only lasts 3 seconds, and you want your Barber Heart to explode in that 3-second duration. However, the sorcerer has a very different exploit glyph. It's going to give you a bunch more vulnerable damage, and you don't have to stay in that window because with this build, we're going to be keeping enemies vulnerable all the time, 100% of the time, which allows us, we only have a 3.5 here, but it allows us to use up to a 4-second Barber Heart to get the absolute most damage out of it because that stored damage is going to be increasing per second. The other two key pieces of the Barber Heart is that one, we need to be able to crit to proc it. This build is going to achieve almost 100% crit chance for the Ice Shards, and we're also going to be boosting our casting speed with this build to cast Ice Shards a ton. Now, how are we able to achieve 100% crit chance? It has to do with our mana. Now, it's very important to get a lot of mana on this build, and on our amulet slot, we are going to be rocking the enchantment core mastery skills cast at or above 100% mana, gain a 54% up to a 60% increased critical strike chance. With this plus our basic crit chance, which is at 36%, we're getting as pretty freaking close to 100% crit chance. Obviously, if there's a max roll, we would be just off 100% crit chance. And with better gear rolls, we could get above 40% crit chance, which is so important. And Ice Shards work so well with the Barber Heart because it pumps damage so well as the amount of crowd control that the SORC has. On this build, we're basically going to be able to stun, freeze, immobilize enemies, and just pump as much damage into possible, and that will allow us to delete these Nightmare 100 level enemies. We CC them, we pump Ice Shard damage into them, and then boom, and then we have enough defenses and survivability to maneuver our way around Nightmare 100 dungeons. Now let's get into the actual gear specifics. You really want mana and cooldown on your helmet. Mana rolls as high as possible on the helmet. It's one of the stat ranges that it can roll the highest, and we really want to be above 100% mana or 100 mana at all times with this build. So mana and cooldown, and then if you can get some armor, some health, some intelligence, that's going to be great. We're also using the Frost Nova, gains an additional charge. Frost Nova is going to be a big source of our vulnerable. It's also a big source of CC, so getting an extra charge of it is really important. Next up, we're using the Raiment of the Infinite. Now, this is a unique chest piece that's really good. It is not required. If you weren't using the Raiment, Chevy says that you should be using a chest piece with the like quad damage reduction, and also the when you damage an elite you get a barrier would be best. But the Raiment is really nice because it's going to allow us to jump into enemies, teleport in and stun them, allowing us to just nuke huge packs, and we can play teleport a lot more aggressively because we've got that safer stun when we jump in. Next up on our gloves, we're going to be using Ranks of Ice Shard and Attack Speed are two of the really big things here. Now, Attack Speed is actually going to benefit our cast speed. I didn't actually know that. I talked to Chevy about that. So Attack Speed is actually going to allow you to pump your ice shards faster, basically as attack speed, and then the rest of these are pretty perfect. Crit chance and lucky hit. Lucky hit chance also being really important for this build, and the more crit chance, the more damage we can pump during the barber. Now, the combo here we're using is really strong. When you hit a crowd-controlled enemy, there is a 50% chance for that crowd control effect to spread to another unaffected enemy. We're going to be dealing a lot more damage to crowd-controlled enemies. We have a lot of crowd control, and we're pairing that with the Exploiter. You gain increased crowd control duration and increased damage to unstoppable enemies. A lot of our damage is going to be amplified against crowd-controlled enemies, so we also have the unstoppable. If an enemy does get unstopped, then we have damage against them as well. And this combo is very, very strong because this CC chain will spread basically the whole screen, or it has the chance to spread the whole screen, and we're going to be scaling our lucky hit pretty high, so this is going to give us a lot of survivability and a lot of damage. Next up for our pants, we've basically got perfect defensive pants. These are going to give us as much survivability as possible. That is what the pants slot is for. Triple damage reduction, plus armor, plus disobedience. On our boots, main thing that you want is movement speed, mana cost, and ranks of that Frost Nova. And then for our weapon, we are getting a weapon that is going to dip its foot into every damage bucket. We've got vulnerable, crit, intelligence, core. That is kind of the god roll. The reason this is a god roll is because it's dipping its foot into every damage bucket. Vulnerable is its own damage bucket in the damage formula. Crit damage is its own damage bucket. Intelligence is its own damage bucket. And core is its own damage bucket, being an additive bucket with a lot of other things. But this is kind of the perfect role for our weapon. And then we've got Ice Shards Pierce, dealing less damage. But this Pierce is going to give us a lot more damage to groups, especially when mob density is high. For the amulet, you're aiming for cooldown reduction, mana cost reduction, ranks of defensive skills, and points into Devouring Blaze. Now, what kind of blew my mind is Chevy doesn't actually have a Devouring Blaze amulet. This is one of the SORC's best offensive passives. It's why so many SORCs use burning damage on their builds to give them increased crit damage against burning enemies and even more damage if they are immobilized. This was nerfed, however, it is still just the best damage passive for the sorcerer. It's super, super important, and Chevy not having points into this and clearing a Nightmare 100 with this build and dealing like 40 to 50 million damage on enemies kind of blows my mind, so I thought that was pretty crazy. He's also got on our rings, the using a cooldown restores mana. Now, I talked to him about why not use a Umbral, and the reason he's using this over like an Umbral aspect is because the mana cost only comes into play when you are using your damage against a single target. If you are one-on-one against a boss, that is when you're going to have mana issues, not when you're in a group, and you've got 4 cooldown skills. So being able to get a bunch of mana back, basically a full free cast of Ice Shards whenever you use one of these 4 cooldowns, is going to help with your single target sustain a ton. Also, max mana is going to be really nice. Crit chance, lucky hit, crit damage, all great things. Vulnerable damage for our rings, and this ring's got crit damage, damage to burning, vulnerable, crit chance, and we're actually using the aspect of control. Now, I know a lot of SORCs used to use this on your amulet. This is still a giant multiplier for the build. However, it got significantly nerfed. This no longer triple dips. It no longer gives you the immobilized, stunned, or frozen against enemies that are like bosses that are staggered. So we're moving that out of the amulet, going for the full crit chance for the really fast stacking of the barber. Still a really, really nice thing, but I don't think it needs to be in the amulet slot anymore. And then lastly, on our focus, our offhand, Chevy said that the up to 5% chance to restore primary resource lucky hit is really nice. Cooldown reduction, mana cost, and then either damage reduction, lucky hit, crit chance are all really, really nice. But we're also going to get the increased damage while we have a barrier. And with this build, if you don't have a barrier, you're dead. You want to have barrier up all the time. We've got a lot of ways to give ourselves barrier, and we're going to be dealing more damage while we have a barrier. For our enchantment slots, pretty standard here, Ice Shards and Firebolt. Firebolt is going to give us that burning damage on enemies whenever we deal damage to them, which is going to give us Devouring Blaze, which is more crit damage for us. And Ice Shards flying towards enemies is going to give us better AoE clear and feels really good because we're freezing everything on this build. Now for our skill tree, we've got 1 point into Frostbolt, 1 point into Firebolt. The points that you put here doesn't actually matter because on this build, we are not going to be using a basic skill. Chevy swaps to the Meteor skill around level 50. The reason we're using Meteor is because it'll guarantee immobilize enemies, and when enemies are immobilized, we are going to get the bonus effect of Devouring Blaze. So putting points into the basic skills doesn't really matter for this build. And this build is set up so that we have basically infinite mana, which we'll talk more about later. But basically, the Meteor is only used against elites. That's the only time you're going to need to bring this down because it's going to give you that immobilize, and basically anything that's a trash mob or a not elite doesn't need this extra immobilize proc, but to have a button to basically cast whenever an elite shows up to get this guaranteed is going to make a massive difference in the feel of this build. Then we get down to our core skills, and we're going down to Ice Shards, Enhanced Ice Shards. Now, this is a bit of a debate. When I played Sorcerer myself, I was debating this a lot, and Chevy broke it down really well for me of why he made this decision to go Destructive. Now, Greater Ice Shards is great for Hell Tides, for clearing large groups of enemies, because when you have a barrier active, Ice Shards treats enemies as if they were frozen, basically casting everywhere. However, this isn't great against elites. It's not great when we need to do single targets, and because we don't have the exploit glyph that everyone else has, we need a consistent way of making enemies vulnerable, and we are going to be shotgun chaining Ice Shards into elites and into enemies, and making sure that they're vulnerable not only for the explosion of the Barber Heart and all the damage that we're going to be doing to it, but just for overall feel of the build. We need enemies to be vulnerable, and so this is much more important than a little bit of extra AoE clear, particularly when we're aiming for higher Nightmare dungeons. Now, the next thing that you'll see that's interesting is no Glass Cannon. Now, I talked to Chevy about this as well, and he said that Glass Cannon is obviously juice. It's got a lot of damage. However, this build does not lack damage. We're dealing 40 million damage to single targets. Damage is not an issue. Survivability can be an issue on the Sorcerer, way more so than damage this season, actually. So Glass Cannon is not used. The 1 point there is from the Infinite Raiment, but he does not go Glass Cannon. Next up, we've got our 4 cooldowns. This is very standard for Sorcerer to use 4 defensive skills. It's unfortunately the state of Sorcerer. We're going to be using Flame Shield. Now, he only said that he uses Flame Shield basically when he knows that damage is incoming, or he's going up against an elite, and he basically uses it like a skill that you would use in Dark Souls. He's putting up his Flame Shield not randomly, not to get extra damage, to make sure that he's staying alive, because it does have not the longest cooldown, but it does have a cooldown. And then the healing. So if you do get hit, if you're in a life or death situation, you pop it, boom, you get that health right back. Damage reduction from teleport, all very standard. Enhanced ice armor. We're not going to give us the more barrier. We've got plenty of barrier with this build. Frost Nova, obviously making enemies vulnerable, no brainer there. Next up, Lucky Hit Chance. Even though Barber kind of hurts with Lucky Hit Chance things, we are relying on Lucky Hit Chance, particularly for 2 things. The big things that we need for Lucky Hit is Frigid Breeze, cold damage against vulnerable enemies, a 20% chance to generate mana. This is a big part of the mana generation on this build. And also the other thing is our Avalanche passive, our Frost skills have a 10% chance to make the next cast of Ice Shards, Frozen Arbor, Blizzard, consume no mana. These both help with mana, and so Lucky Hit is going to feel or make this build feel a lot better to just spam all of your abilities and never drop below that 100 mana threshold. Anytime we use a cooldown, we get 30% of our max life as barrier, and we've got 4 cooldowns, and whenever we spend 100 mana, we get damage reduction. These are big survivability tools. Then we're going into here, we're grabbing Meteor, and Meteor guarantees immobilize, big important for that elite damage and that Devouring Blaze against elites. Next, we grab another Lucky Hit Chance for our abilities to instantly freeze. Freeze is not only a lot of control, but it's also going to give us a lot more damage on this build. And then we're coming down and grabbing everything here. Frost skills deal more damage to elites. We deal increased damage to vulnerable, mana back, and Hoarfrost is also really nice. You deal increased damage to chilled enemies and increased damage to frozen. Everything's basically going to be chilled and frozen. Frozen enemies still count as chilled enemies, so we're getting a lot of damage from this node. With the setup of this build, we do not need Fiery Surge, even though we are using Burning, and it would be nice to get some health and some extra mana regen. I talked to Chevy, and he said that the way that this build is set up is you're going to be getting all of your mana back all the time with the amount of Lucky Hit Chance that we have. We have 56% base Lucky Hit Chance, and then when we get into our Paragon board, we've got nodes for even more Lucky Hit Chance. If we go over to These nodes, we got Advantage, which is going to give us even more lucky hit chance, which is really nice. And dealing cold damage to vulnerable enemies also gives us even more lucky hit chance. Plenty of that on this build to give us a ton of mana regen. And lastly, we've got our Paragon board. Now, Chevy said that he used the Paragon board that a content creator named Northwar put out. That is an amazing SORC player. So all of the credit to the Paragon board goes to Northwar. It's set up amazingly well to give us a lot more survivability, more vulnerable damage. We're getting a lot of vulnerable damage. We're getting more lucky hit. We're getting more mana. Going for more mana is one of the most important things to grab super early to get over that 100 mana threshold whenever we're casting our skills. And then the glyphs that we're going to be using are the Control glyph, the Destruction glyph, the Elementalist glyph, the Exploit glyph, the Flame Feeder glyph, and the Tactician glyph. All of these are going to pair really well. We've got increased damage to chilled, slowed, stunned, and frozen enemies, and increased damage to crowd-controlled enemies, increased crit damage, and crit damage is going to give us an accumulating increase of damage on enemies. Elementalist is going to give us that increase to non-physical, which is going to be our elementals. And then we've also got the Exploit, more vulnerable, dealing damage to vulnerable enemies, increases our damage. We've got a lot of things that stack up on enemies. So the way that this build is able to do so much damage is that we've got all these things that are stacking. The Barber is stacking, the Destruction glyph is stacking, the Exploit glyph is stacking. So many things are stacking that when you have these high health targets, we're actually able to nuke them very, very well, especially when they're frozen and we can just focus all of our damage into them. Flame Feeder, increased damage to burning enemies, increased damage to burning targets, works really well with our enchant slot. And then the Tactician for an increased damage whenever we use a defensive skill, which is all the time, and a bonus to our rare nodes. I will have a link to Northwar's Paragon board so that you can copy it. Full credit to Northwar. And yeah, guys, that is it for the build. Guys, that is going to do it for the video. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to check out Northwar and Chevy down in the description. I will have a link to both of their channels. And I hope that this video, even if you're not playing Sorcerer, gave you kind of a bigger insight on how much damage these classes are actually doing this season, because this kind of shocked me, especially with this class not having like perfect gear yet and still clearing Nightmare 100s at 10 levels below. Pretty wild. Also, let me know if you guys enjoy this kind of content. I have been like just dumping all of my time into Diablo, and I still haven't been able to make it to all of the classes. And so I did think of using my friends and getting their help to make or help me get more content onto the channel. If that's something that you like and you're here for like other builds and other classes, let me know. If you didn't enjoy this, also let me know. I'm looking for genuine feedback. I will catch y'all in the next one, guys. Take care. Peace.